Welcome back to part 2 of my tutorial series on how to recreate the store home screen design in Flutter. Now in part 1 we recreated this curvy effect using border radius, and in part 2 we're going to focus on designing the app bar section. In part 3 we're going to do the headphone banner, in part 4 we're going to do the products, and in part 5 we're going to end with the bottom panel. This tutorial series is aimed at beginners, so feel free to approach this in these individual parts, or you can just wait for all of the videos to release and approach them all together. But I'm going to try to explain a lot of the things that I do here, and hopefully you're able to understand the various decisions I make along the way. And also, hopefully, you learn a little bit more about working with Flutter. So, the very first thing we want to do, as always, when working with a design, is to break it down. So let's break down the design that we want to work with. So we have two sections here that we have a couple of sections here, that we want to build out over the course of the next few videos in the white container. As you remember in the previous video, we have a white container and then we have the gray container. So in the white container, everything is kind of laid out in a column. So we're going to use the column widget eventually. But for now, we're just focused on the app bar. And in any Flutter application, the way you can actually use or set up an app bar, which is basically the bar that's typically at the top of an app that contains menu buttons, other buttons, maybe an avatar like here. That app bar we can set up using a widget called the Scaffold widget. Now, if you don't know what the Scaffold widget is, an easy way to learn more about it is by going to Google and just typing Scaffold Flutter. And you'll learn from here that the Scaffold class basically helps implement the basic material design visual layout structure. And so this is what a basic scaffold looks like. It has an app bar, typical material blue with a shadow background, and a floating action button with a shadow background. So we're going to use the app bar to design the actual app bar itself, and we're going to place the icons. Now, for this icon, we're just going to use a simple grid icon. For this one, we're going to use a search icon, magnifying glass. Should be pretty easy to find and use. But for this one, we're going to use an avatar image. We're going to try to give it nice rounded corners. And then we're going to also give it this online-offline status icon or circle. So now that we know all of that, let's get started. The very first thing, though, that I'm going to do in the code is, last time we wrote all of our code here to set up the curve. But this time I'm going to move it out into its own widget called a home screen, and that'll help clean up this section a little bit, and we can start building the app bar out here. So we saw that the Scaffold widget is a widget that implements the basic material design, and we can use the Scaffold widget to actually set up an app bar as well. And so in the app bar, if you look at it, it takes in a app bar widget, which exists. And inside of the app bar widget, there are a couple of properties that are relevant to us. But the first property is called leading. Leading takes in a widget that goes into the beginning part of the app bar, or the leading part of the app bar. And so that's where we're going to put our grid icon. And so to render an icon on the screen, you can use the icon widget. And the icon widget takes in one required property, which is what icon do you want to use. Now, to use or render any type of icon, you need to provide some icon data as to what that icon is. And there's a class called icons, which contains various icon data definitions. You'll see that the class these classes are icon data classes, and each class is defined for a different type of material icon. Now, if you're ever looking for a particular material icon, there is a website by Google called Material Icons by Google, and you can just search over here to see what icons are out there. So we want to use a grid icon, And so let's use this grid view icon. So you just see the name from here, and you go back to the app, and I'm going to bring the simulator back up, and we're going to use grid. And you'll see that with autocomplete, there's like a bunch of grid icons, but the one we want to use is grid view. And there we go. So we see that there's a blue app bar with a white icon here. And this is the standard default styling of the app bar. But we don't want that. We want the icon to be our secondary color, because that's the color palette we've chosen. The primary color is the white, and the secondary color is the gray. So we're going to give it the secondary color because we want the app bar background to be the primary color. And so the way we can change the styling of the app bar is by using the app bar theme property of our theme object. So the theme property within the top level material app takes in a theme data object, and this theme data is where you can define common styling rules for the rest of your app. And so it comes with the app bar theme property, which takes in an app bar theme object, and inside of this app bar theme object you can style the background color, which we're going to set to primary color here. There we go. Now we can't exactly see the icon because it's the same color as the background, so let's change that really quick. The app bar theme also comes with a property called icon theme, and inside of the icon theme you can set the color, and icon theme takes in a class of type icon theme data. And so we can use let's see, the color we wanted was secondary color, and ta-da, there we go. The other thing we want to do is we want to give icons a default size in the app bar. So the size I want to give it is, let's say, 36, and I'm going to create a constant outside because we might be using this number in a couple of places. So I'm going to call it icon size and give it a size 36, and we're going to use that property here. And it has to be a double. That's why there's a red line here. So if you hover, it'll tell you the argument type int can't be assigned to the parameter type double. Two ways you can do this in the Dart language. One is just put a 0.0, and then it'll implicitly know that icon size is a double type. The other is you can do const double, icon size is equal to 36, and it'll also know that it's a double, and you don't have to put in the decimal if you don't want to. So we can do either of them. So here we are, we have the icon size set up, it looks big, it looks good. And now the next thing we need to do is get rid of this little shadow that we have because we want it to look seamless with the rest of the app. And the way we can get rid of the shadow is by going to our app bar widget, which comes with a property called elevation. We want to set this elevation property to, whoops, I was writing it in the wrong place, my bad. We want to set the elevation property to 0. Elevation is basically the distance between the current widget and the background, and the higher the elevation, the greater the distance, the stronger the shadow. So if I put this elevation at 5, we'll see that there's a pretty heavy shadow. If I put it at 10, you'll see that there's an even heavier shadow. If I put it at 15, that shadow just gets heavier, and then if I put it at 1, the shadow is like virtually gone. It's basically a border. And so I'm going to put it at 0 because we want it to look seamless, and there we go. Beautiful. Now the next thing we want to work on is the trailing or ending part of the app bar, which contains these two things. The first is the icon search button, and since we're a pro at using icons, we can actually use the icon widget, but it's going to be a button. We know that. This is a search button that you would tap and maybe like a search field would pop up or something like that. I don't know. But it needs to be a button. So in Flutter, there's a widget called the icon button. And in the app bar, there is a property called the actions property, which takes in a list of widgets that are meant to go into this action bar, is what we call it in the app bar. So this actions bar basically contains the various widgets that you can click on or interact with to do some action. And that's what we're going to use here. So we're going to use two widgets. The first is the icon button I mentioned, which takes in an icon widget like we have here. And so and that icon widget, as we know, takes in a specific icon data. And so for this one, we can kind of just search for it in the autocomplete. We know it's going to be a search icon. There we go. You also need to provide the onPressed function, and the onPressed function basically just indicates what should happen. It's the code that tells you what should happen if somebody clicks on this button. So if I click on this button, some code inside of here will execute. So if I put in print Azaro is awesome, and then I just hit this button, it's going to output this in my debug console with that print command in Dart. So I'm just going to leave it empty because I'm not planning on clicking that button anytime soon, but this is where you would do extra stuff for search. Now you'll notice that the size is small. It's the default size, even though we set a size in the app bar icon theme here. And that's because the icon button imposes its own theme property, its own size property on the icon it embeds. So you can see that there's an icon size property, and on this we're also going to use the same icon size variable that we created earlier. And so there we go. Now it's sized up. And finally, the last thing we want to add to this app bar is the image. Now for the avatar image, I'm just going to go to Google, find some kind of like avatar image, and not that avatar. We're going to use an avatar image. This one looks pretty good. It's what I've worked with before in some other things. So we're going to use this, go to the website, and grab the URL. Copy image address. I'm going to put that URL inside of a constant so it's easier to work with. There we go. All right, bringing back the simulator, we're going to look at putting in an image. So to use images, there is an image widget called image, pretty simple. And it comes with a few different helper constructors to initialize an image from different places. So initializing an image from a local asset within your app, initializing an image from a network, from a URL, which is what we're going to use. And there's a couple of others, but we just want the network one. And so I'm going to take that, and we're going to provide it the image URL. Because if you hover over it, you'll see that it just takes in the SRC, or the source. In this case, it's the URL. So if I do that, we've got a pretty happy guy there. Now, the next thing we want to do is maybe give it a bit of a rounded corner, like in the preview here. It's a little rounded, and it has the red circle on the top right. So the way we're going to set that up is by doing a clipping of the image. And what I mean by that is there is a set of widgets called the clip widgets that help you control the clipping of the boundaries of an embedded child widget. And I'll show you what I mean by that in just a second. So let's wrap this in a widget called the ClipRRect widget. And so what this does, if we click on it, we'll learn about it. It's a widget that clips its child using a rounded rectangle. And that's what we want. We want the image to be a rounded rectangle. We can't use a container with a box decoration because the container styling will apply to its background. It's not going to apply to the image itself. If the image went over the background of a container, then the image would overflow, and you'd see a nasty overflow error here unless you take care of it. So we're going to use a ClipRRect because it's meant specifically for these purposes. The next thing we're going to do inside of the ClipRRect is we're going to specify a border radius, and I think a good, decent border radius might be something like 8, maybe. So we're going to use border radius.circular, and let's use about 8. Now, we're not seeing a major change. Something happened, but nothing crazy. So the first thing I'm going to do is move my ClipRRect out of the icon button, which I just realized I did. So I'm going to remove that, and I'm going to put it on this image. I'm sorry about that. So we have the ClipRRect here, and inside of the ClipRRect, I'm going to put it in. I'm going to put the border radius that I was trying to apply, which is going to be border radius.circular 8. Okay, there we go. Now you can see something is kind of happening. It looks pretty decent. I think that's a nice border radius. The next thing we want to do is give it a little bit of a margin on the right, or a little bit of, just spacing between the side of the screen. And there are two things we want to do here. The first is we also want the image to maybe be a little bit smaller. And if you want to do that, you can just set the width or height inside of the image widget. And so typically if you set the width to, let's say, if you set the width to 36, it's going to make it smaller, and it's going to make sure that the aspect ratio is maintained. You'll notice that the roundedness doesn't look as good as it did before, and that's because of the way sizing works in Flutter. And the way we can get around this is by wrapping this whole thing in a container. Or I believe we can also do this with a padding widget, and let's try this for a second. And so with a padding widget, it basically makes sure that there's enough space for the image inside of it, or the widget inside of it, to actually get clipped correctly. So now that kind of looks as good as what we had before. And now the next thing we want to do is we want to put this inside of a stack widget. So I'm just using the column widget here to hijack its name. And now we have a stack. And inside of the stack widget, we want to do two things, right? One is we want to make sure that this is in the background, and we create this circular widget that'll go in the foreground. For the circle widget, we can just basically do a container that we will make look like a circle. So for that, we're going to go to the container widget as a second child in the stack. And in the container widget, we're basically going to add the child, which is going to be nothing. So we don't need the child. Take that back. We're just going to give it a color. Let's say colors.red, and nothing will show up because it doesn't have a size yet. So let's give it a width and height of about 12 maybe. And so there we go. And there's a padding coming from the first widget. So there is empty space above. And so the next thing we can actually do now is turn this into a circle by giving it a decoration and then a box decoration and setting the border radius on it. To make it look like a perfect circle, we want the radius to equal its width or height. And so over here, we need to use border radius dot circular and put in 12. And you'll see that there's an error because, as we saw in the last video, if you're defining a box decoration, you need to put your styling information inside of that. And so we can't define the color separately, and we're going to put it inside here. And there we go. The circle looks pretty good. And the last thing left to do is to move it over to the right. We can probably do this with the positioned widget, if you remember from the previous video. So I'm going to add the positioned widget here. And the positioned widget lets us control the position of a widget very specifically with coordinates. So for example, maybe we want the widget to be a little lower. So let's say we lower it by maybe 6 might be too much, maybe 3. And so there it's like perfectly going through the middle. And then we want to move it over to the right side. And so we're going to say right 0. And so what these values are doing is basically it moves the widget to X pixels away from the top, X pixels away from the right. And similarly, there's a left and bottom property to move it X pixels from the left, X pixels from the bottom. So for the right, we also want to use 3, and that looks pretty good, right? And that looks like a pretty nice app bar we have up here. The last thing we might want to do, as I mentioned before, is we want to give a little bit of margining space to the right and to the left. And the way we're going to do that is by adding a sized box. With the sized box, it allows us to basically use an empty widget with some sizing information in it. And a sized box itself will make sure that any child widget inside of it is constrained to the size of the box. But in this case, we're just using it as an empty widget or a placeholder widget to provide some margin. So we're going to put, let's say, about maybe 24 pixels over here. And let's see how that looks. And we actually want this to be outside of the stack because it's the last element in the actions list. And there we go. So 24 looks a little aggressive. If we go back to the design, it might be a little bit too much. And so we can actually go ahead and reduce it a little bit more to maybe 16, and that feels a lot better and a lot more cleaner here. And don't forget to add padding on the left to the original grid we had to clean up the app bar. So we have the leading icon here, and we're going to give it some padding with the padding widget, which allows you to set padding using edge insets, which contains different values or different ways to set padding on different sides. So we only want to set it on the left side, so I'm going to use dot only and set it on the left. And with this, we get 16 is the value we used, and we want to make sure we set it only on the left. There we go. And that looks pretty good. So there you have it. We have a nice looking app bar, and I know this video was a little long and all we did was create this app bar, but I think it was important to cover some of the finer details and what we were doing and how we were doing it. But I hope you understood how you can use a scaffold and an app bar to get a good looking layout of your initial app. In the next video, I'm going to cover how to create the headphone banner that we saw before, which is in the next video, I'm going to cover how to create this headphone banner. And in the video after that, we'll do the products. And then in the final video, we'll do the bottom panel. The next couple of videos will definitely be shorter than this video, so stay tuned for those. Thank you.